So, the other night, I was looking for something to watch on the free online streaming services, and I saw this pop up. Now, I realize this is probably old news to Americans. This came out a few months ago, but I just noticed this pop up on the free sites, and whenever I look at contemporary films, I always come away totally disgusted at the combination of the agendas being promoted along with the visceral, grotesque violence. I always come away from any modern film feeling totally sort of disgusted. And I saw this pop up and was quite curious about it. And I have to say, as I always follow the main rule of Fight Club, which is that you never pay for anything digital. First, you have your electricity, you have to pay for that. Then you have your cat food, and then anything left over, obviously, is spent on analog vinyl. So, digital products are always free. Important to remember that. Anyway, so this is the true story of a national spiritual awakening in the early 1970s and its origins within a community of teenage hippies in Southern California, the Jesus Revolution. And I remember vaguely reading about some of this stuff, which was around 1970. And this film is a recreation of that. And in America, like the whole, Christian movie thing is a whole genre in itself that we're not really aware of or come into contact with in Europe. But I noticed this had Kelsey Grammer, and it's interesting. Kelsey Grammer, most famous for portraying the sort of pompous liberal Frasier, actually seems in real life rather more conservative. And correct me if I'm wrong, I think he's kind of on that scale of NRA supporters, that kind of person. So that piqued my interest that Kelsey Grammer was in it. And watching the film, it was interesting that it wasn't like a kind of low budget amateur dramatics. It had the production quality of a Hollywood film, and begins right away with using the secular rock and roll music of late 60s, early 70s. Beautifully filmed, that Californian sunshine. And I thought it was, it's an interesting story. So I watched this the other night. True story of Greg Laurie, who was like a cadet in like one of these military schools, kind of square, and comes into contact with these kind of hippie characters. And they meet up with the pastor, Chuck Smith, played by Kelsey Grammer, and the daughter of the pastor meets Lonnie Frisbee as the kind of charismatic Bible quoting hippie. And so they're convinced, those dirty hippies, but then they're actually have a genuine interest in Jesus. Jesus is all right. I'll just go up and leave it on this. And I think that some of the same producers and people were involved in The Chosen. Produced by Lionsgate. You'd have to do your deep dive into the background of Lionsgate. But I won't go. I mean, you see, there's a lot to unpack in this film. But let's just kind of stick to the main points for a brief chat rather than a 10-hour analysis. So what was really interesting in this is it shows the characters, this Greg Laurie, and I suppose I have to point out, Greg Laurie is very famous, well-known pastor in one of these evangelical megachurches in America. Again, someone we're just not exposed to that kind of culture on this side of the pond as people in America. So I'm kind of looking at some of this a bit askance, really as a foreign culture, but it is fascinating. Anyway, so we get Greg Laurie as like a teenager. He makes hippie friends. He's very square, wearing like a cadet's uniform. And then the hippies encourage him to go. They go and see Janis Joplin. And what really struck me was they were really going to the trouble of portraying the hippie scene in a kind of genuine way, in the sense of how it appealed to youth. It wasn't just a kind of dirty hippie as you might expect in a very sort of conservative film, because we actually get the scene of Greg Laurie and his future wife watching Janis Joplin. And then what's really fascinating is we actually have an actor on the stage of the rock concert portraying Dr. Timothy Leary, giving his tune in, turn on, drop out speech. And then they have a plane fly over the audience and drop little packets of LSD for everybody to take. And I'm curious if that actually happened. Offhand, I don't recall reading of a concert where they had a plane fly over dropping LSD. But aside from that, it was fascinating to see this future evangelical preacher, Greg Laurie, actually telling the audience that he took LSD with his future wife. And they go on their trip and they just portray it as a kind of soft focus rather than anything crazy visually. But that was quite effective in itself. And you get them like hanging out with the hippies, and then they sort of suggest that what the hippie characters are doing in their kind of escapism is really falling into a kind of nihilism of moral relativism, that they're genuine seekers on a quest, but they're becoming lost, perhaps portraying Timothy Leary as, Pied Piper. But of course, Timothy Leary is a very strange character who can be dismissed as controlled opposition or an intelligence project. And there are a lot of rabbit holes one can go down in this film. You see, I suppose to cut to the chase, the whole film seems like an intelligence project in itself, talking about the intelligence projects of at the time of the late 60s, early 70s. And at the same time, offering a kind of hopeful, joyous message of community and non-drug induced transcendence to a new, younger audience, of saying, "Oh, hey, we're not afraid of like listening to rock and roll," and like there's a funny scene where the hippie preacher is at like a college, and all the kids are hanging out, listening to different people, and the first guy standing up to talk is like a kind of black nationalist guy talking about slavery, and then the next guy is a Satanist, and then Frisbee, the preacher, comes on and goes, "Oh, that was real far out. Listening to these ideas, but have you heard about Jesus?" It's kind of funny. So anyway, we basically get two intersecting stories in the film. One is Greg Laurie as this teenager, and his wife, his future wife, having these kind of hippie experiences as they look for, genuine spiritual path, you could say, and then how they come to intersect with Frisbee as the hippie preacher who comes into contact through the daughter of the pastor, Chuck Smith, played by Kelsey Grammer. And Kelsey Grammer is shown as the pastor of, the kind of dying church with the older patriarchal attendants. And, he opens his door to the hippies, and he's, kind of aghast at this and trying to manage it. And then it becomes this big congregation, and, eventually it kind of wins people over, and this sort of meeting of the generations, and then how this grows and grows, and how Frisbee is this charismatic character, but at the same time is something of a Pied Piper himself. And we see him doing scenes of miraculous healing of the faithful, which almost suggests something demonic. Now, in real life, Frisbee was this eccentric, gay character, a controversial figure, and in the film, we see him involved with this for about a year, and then he leaves. They don't want to make it a film about Frisbee. They tried to center it more on Chuck Smith and Greg Laurie. Greg Laurie sort of becomes, I suppose Greg Laurie is like, we see him inspired by Frisbee, but then becomes the acolyte of Chuck Smith. And the film ends with Chuck Smith giving Laurie his own church, where he begins to baptize the curious and faithful. And we're told Laurie is about 18 years old. And that in itself is very odd, because it makes me think of Rudolf Steiner, who I believe said something along the lines that you wouldn't have the experience or spiritual capacity or insight to be a teacher until you're over 40 or 42. And it's striking to think, what kind of pastor would an 18-year-old be with their experience of life? Now, the real funny thing is that the film ends with this journalist who's been following the story along, and how this scene has grown and grown. And like the big triumph at the end of the film is that it turns out that the journalist following the story was actually writing this cover article feature for Time magazine. And that's portrayed as being this great accomplishment, or this great recognition that Time magazine has gone to the trouble of covering it and then celebrating it with a cover article. It seems like this great external validation of what they've done in their local community and their scene and what they've built, that Time magazine is giving them this validation. And you immediately think how strange this is, because we're being encouraged to think of these people as being genuine seekers and searchers of spiritual truth, the way and the light, followers of Christ and the gospel, so on, so forth. But if that was the case, why would you care about Time magazine? Why would this external validation by the mainstream media, which in reality as well is just a further outreach of military industrial complex and intelligence agencies, you can only interpret Time magazine as being an agent of promotion and cultural engineering. You see, with all these late 60s, early 70s countercultural figures, events, music, Laurel Canyon, and cults from Hare Krishnas to Jesus freaks, and Manson family, and everything else in between on that spectrum of the kaleidoscope. There were just so many rabbit holes one could go down, and discussing some of this stuff, attempting to grasp what happened historically and what it all led to and where we are now, you can easily sound very paranoid, sort of schizophrenic, paranoid obsession of conspiracy behind every shadow. But I don't see it like that. I see it more as trying to see the reality of what we see in music, film, television, newspapers, magazines. That what's promoted to us is cultural engineering through soft power, which is a historical fact of the Cold War. That you could argue the Beatles, Rolling Stones, Levi, denim jeans, and Coca-Cola did more to win the Cold War than nuclear weapons or proxy wars. You get the point I'm making. So in my mind, we're looking at a recalling of this moment of cultural engineering, and then it's presented as a triumph, and then ends as a kind of inspiration for something to happen now. Because as I said, so much of what we are presented with is utterly disgusting and degenerate, violent, transgressive, against human dignity and natural law, perversion, and in general, Sodom and Gomorrah. And I was looking at another brief video that was just touching on the obvious controversies of some of the people like Frisbee and so on. And one of the top comments under the video was a gentleman saying, my 14-year-old daughter watched this film and was inspired, to give her heart to Jesus Christ. This is a wonderful film. And as I said, what's presented to us as culture is so disgusting that you see this as a counterbalancing force, but it's like everything is herding you to pre-prepared exits, a herding of the sheep, which is sad to say, because I really enjoyed the whole vibe of this film, because what it was really talking about was how human beings have this, natural desire for community. They have a natural capacity to want to live in joy and peace, to experience love and connect to something that is transcendent beyond the visible realm that streams into this reality. And for me, you know, what animates life is obviously a divine, transcendent force, and names are placed upon it, such as Yahweh and Jehovah and Lord and Jesus Christ, and so on and so forth. And I would have to do a whole separate other video discussing religion, spirituality, Christianity to get into it, because it's really an entire esoteric subject that's beyond the scope of this video. But what I'm trying to say is, as human beings who become aware that they have a soul and spirit that's animating them, that we're presented with turning towards our basest desires in a kind of nihilistic moral relativism on one sense, with the sort of Crowley-esque philosophy of Timothy Leary. And then we're presented with the opposite in like a sober discovery of inner love and light of Christianity. I mean, the society we live in, which is Western civilization, to me is very much a dialectic. It's the Masonic chessboard, the black and white squares. And when we look at the last 100 years, or if you want to go back 200 years to Napoleon, what I see is best described that we're watching a game of chess with white and black pawns moving across the white and black squares of duality. But the game of chess is being played by one person. And if you don't know what role you're playing, you are a pawn in the game. And perhaps the only winning move is not to play the game. You know, left, right, etc., etc. You know, George Bush, Bill Clinton, George Bush, Obama, Trump, Biden. You know, that's the game of chess being played out by the uni party. And it's always trying to entangle you in a choice to play. And it's hard not to see films like this, these expressions of soft power of the military-industrial complex and technocratic system, as being offering something nice and hopeful, not a better way of living, compared to the degenerate culture being promoted to you. It's like choose one or the other. Because what really kills this film is the ending. I feel in a way like film has always been about manipulating your emotions. It's like playing the emotions of the human nervous system like a piano, because being in a cinema is like being in a dark temple, and we kind of sit open mouthed, passively having this projection played on our inner self. And when people see like scenes of violence, or horror, they often say, "Oh, I know it's not real. I know they're just actors. I know that's not real. I get like a thrill. I get a scare. I get a fright. But I don't believe the subconscious mind, in the moment of being frightened or excited, um, understands the difference. Your conscious mind can say, "Oh, that's just an actor who's had their head torn off and been disemboweled or whatever." But I don't believe the subconscious mind knows the difference. And I don't think we understand what the effect of these images, of synthetic digital images, are of being written into the subconscious mind. I believe on a basic level, violent films are there to help sort of manifest a more degraded and violent environment for us to live in, sort of dehumanizing and sort of acclimatizing us and making us more paranoid and fearful and so on. And as I've said before, that I think now, through all the experimentation and all the research and all the stuff going back to like MK Ultra and all that stuff, that films are very much like a sort of outreach of the military industrial complex. And I see so much of this stuff in films that are rated PG, that are an attempt to kind of simulate a traumatic experience to the probably mainly teenage audience watching. And I think it's all very, very deliberate. And I don't think anybody really understands the full extent of the effects this has on the human being. Because really, I think we're far more vulnerable to all this stuff than anybody dare realize. I think it would actually be terrifying for people to fully comprehend how vulnerable people are to all the like subliminals, the violence, the brainwashing, the flicker rate of the screen, this sort of attempt to sort of encode information into the subconscious mind and so on. It's essentially this idea of weaponizing empathy. I heard that term somewhere, I don't know where, and I thought that is perfect, because you see, human beings in their day-to-day life are naturally empathetic, um, and that's what carries us on the journey of watching a film. And in this context, we're watching something really beautiful of people finding community and meaning, a connection to something transcendent, in their life. And that's, and even sort of like union and reunion of family and generations coming together, the generation gap and all of that. And that's also all such beautiful things. And but the end of the film, the end of this film, The Jesus Revolution, it gives us this like triumph that Time magazine has recognized them. And then we cut to the archive footage of what really happened, and we see these huge crowds, and then the newsreel footage and the news reports and the newspaper reports. And then it goes forwards to the modern day scenes of these vast American evangelical megachurches that Greg Laurie then became famously involved in. And then I just feel sort of, I suppose, sort of cynical or confronted by the reality that I can't just watch a film about a group of people in California in 1970 who found a religious and spiritual path. No, you have to be confronted with the fact that this is cultural engineering. This is all stemming out of intelligence projects as much as Timothy Leary was. It can't be denied that that's what this is a part of. I don't know. Is that dispiriting? Is that cynical? Is it paranoid? Well, the evangelicals. I mean, that's what we discovered, that Greg Laurie is part of this evangelical scene with these vast megachurches, and these megachurches are run on particular tax codes that grants them these strange charity status, and they're worth billions. So there's your financial aspect of mammon. And before I go on about that, let me just go back a minute and say that I couldn't help escape that feeling in the film, which was the idea of, give unto Caesar, which is Caesar's, because we get one scene earlier in the film where Greg Laurie is in his military academy and they're doing like a duck and cover scene about if there was a nuclear attack, and that reinforces the idea that nuclear weapons are a real threat. Maybe they are, maybe they're not. Maybe that's like a psyop along the ideas of Miles Mathis and friends. And then the other scene is where all the hippie Jesus freaks are watching the moon landing. So we get two direct scenes that give unto Caesar, that Caesar wishes you to believe in the threat of nuclear weapons, and Caesar wishes you to believe in the moon landing. I'm not going to get bogged down in going through all that stuff, but were those scenes necessary, or is that just more subtle propaganda for you to believe in the sort of cultural architecture? Why are those two scenes in the film? Anyway, I was talking about the evangelicals, and here, in Ireland, in Britain, in Europe, we don't really understand the evangelicals as a cultural force. But in America, it seems like a force that sort of totally polluted Christianity and sort of was used like a weaponized Christianity to capture large swathes of conservative people who were never going to be adopted into the liberal culture. And what it seemed to do was create a sort of controlled population of people who were pro-Israel, who believed the Israelis were the promised people and land of the Bible. It's, a special, unique people who deserved, the support of Americans' military capacity or whatever, to die in their wars. And it's like a conservative base of voters created along a kind of weird religious ideology, and it seems to overlap with this belief in the end times and rapture, and Jesus is returning. I mean, let's just have a look at a couple of things here. For instance, I just typed, Greg Laurie COVID into the search engine. And it's funny what you can see with very simple searches that tell you about the world you're living in and what you're being presented with. Because the first couple of things that come up, where the first was about he's saying he was tested positive after he attended this outbreak at the White House, and I remember that being a big story at the time, that there was some barbecue event or whatever at the White House, all these conservative figures and all these people testing positive after the event, and it was a big story at the time. And what do you know? Greg Laurie was there. And then the next thing we got a year after that is Greg Laurie was making a video. He was making a video on Twitter and I think YouTube saying the sniffle jab isn't the mark of the beast, to reassure his faithful sheep. And I was just fascinated by this, that and there, evangelical struggle to combat sniffle misinformation. I was just fascinated that this was like the first stuff to pop up, because obviously, like, Greg Laurie is very well known in America. Like, he's someone I don't know a lot about. But he's right in there. He's in the White House. He's with Trump. Like, look at this. When the churches were shut, he did an online program, Harvest at Home, became one of the most watched internet worship services in America. And on Palm Sunday 2020, President Trump tweeted he would be watching Harvest at Home. And listen, if you think Trump is a Christian, then I'm a giraffe. Like, let's just put that out there. The evangelicals are used purely as a voting bloc and as a culturally engineered perversion of Christianity to create a embedded support of the state of Israel in American culture. On the harvest.org website, with Pastor Greg Laurie, here's a whole thing I found, again, straightforward internet search after watching the film. Why Israel Matters. Talking about God's chosen people, so on, a blessed nation. Anti-Semitism came from the devil, the promised land. There's Netanyahu with his quotes about fulfillment of prophecy and Return of the Jews, a super sign that the prophetic time clock is ticking. And here's Greg Laurie writing this himself. The importance of Jerusalem. And, of course, it was Trump who recognized Jerusalem. And what did he do? I think he moved the embassy, the American embassy, I believe. We need to stand by our Jewish friends. Stand up for the nation of Israel. They are still God's chosen people. God still has plans for them, and revival will break out in their nation again. Okay, so look, let's get something straight here. I'm obliged to point out that, the dog in the street knows that the modern state of Israel and its inhabitants have no connection uh, culturally, genetically, in their DNA to the inhabitants of Israel 2,000 years ago, to the 12, 12 tribes of Israel, the Hebrew people. The people who live in Israel are descendants of Eastern Europeans and Turks and Central Asia and the rest of it. I don't know how much you can and can't say on YouTube, but I'm sorry, evangelicals. Uh, they're no more a special group of people than you or me, in that we are all divine beings. So you see, we go from this hippie film of innocent joy, discovery, family union, community, to evangelical megachurches 50 years later. And what kind of community is there in a megachurch? I mean, it boggles my mind seeing video of those megachurches with thousands of people, like at a rock concert, seeing the Rolling Stones in a stadium. I can't help but think that when you have that many people, there is no community going on. What you have going on is energy harvesting. A community of people is something like 200 or 300 people. If the Jesus Revolution was a genuine movement to inspire people, what it should have inspired people to do was set up their own religious, spiritual communities of 200 to 300 people, the size of a village. That's community. 100,000 people in a field or in a megachurch is not a community. That's like a whipping up of an energy to be sent to some thing or some force for the benefit of various perhaps entities, or perhaps more prosaically just political, social, cultural forces. And in that sense is quite plainly and in your face, cultural engineering. We live in a kind of insane laboratory, or you could say society is a laboratory run by mad scientists. The natural world is so stunningly beautiful. But what has been overlaid upon it is something engineered. When you ask people about their opinion or their beliefs, or people are talking about what they see on the news, it's all a regurgitation of other people's ideas and thoughts, beliefs, opinions, ideologies. It's all the midwith garbage of everything from, the top 10 books to the top 10 records to the top 10 films. It's all soft power. And it was always soft power from the beginning, from the beginning of Hollywood through the, like you're watching a funny Charlie Chaplin film, and then a few years later, Charlie Chaplin is encouraging you to join the army to go and fight in the trenches in World War One. You're watching a funny Laurel and Hardy film in the 1930s, and then in the 1940s, they're encouraging you to join the army to fight in World War Two. That soft power is always there. it's funny watching older stuff because you're still getting the propaganda, but it's propaganda about old stuff, about old events, old geopolitical systems and economic scenarios. So it's all much more transparent to see. I mean, it's so easy to be revolted by everything now, and I think it's very hard to watch anything. There is nothing that doesn't have an agenda in it. And that provokes a sense of, do you live in a kind of constant cynicism and paranoia? Or do you come to a sense of reality that everything that's presented to us is cultural engineering that's trying to massage our senses and sensibilities towards what is acceptable about what should be made manifest and the desired future outcome on behalf of the technocratic priest class, etc., etc., etc. It's just, it's all so strange. We live in such a strange reality. The reality of the society that's overlaid on the reality of the natural world. And we can be inspired by so much of this culture, by all these Pied Pipers, from Timothy Leary and the Beatles through to Mr. Frisbee and the Jesus Freaks. Like one small thing that isn't mentioned at all in the film, because this is set in California in 1970, is that at the same time in Britain you had the musical and the album released of Jesus Christ Superstar, and followed by Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, which were equally engineered. Christianity is cool, Jesus is cool, which happened at exactly the same time. It's like different divisions of the intelligence agencies. I love all that vintage rock and roll, from the Beatles and Rolling Stones and Jimi Hendrix and Bob Dylan. But it's absolutely impossible to ignore the fact that there's like a circle of influence going around, from the intelligence agencies to organized crime, to Tavistock and so on. And all of this stuff can make you sound like such a crank and paranoid. But you can't ignore, 50 years later, it's an actual fact that, there is Tavistock in the actual mainstream news, encouraging people to chop off bits of themselves to further, the transhuman agenda that eventually would presumably like to arrive at a place where there is no gender and everybody is made like clones in a vat, as we were foretold by the earliest engineers like Aldous Huxley. And there you can be with your child watching, Star Wars, the Clone Wars, and it's all in your face and it's all just gobbled down like sugar candy. But they're telling you the society and future they desire as you sit open mouthed in the gloom of the temple of the cinema, watching the magical theatre of the absurd place all its ideas, all its horrors, directly inside of your mind and imagination, until they can get the technology into you, It's the reality we face as, organic sovereign beings with free will and a divine soul. It's our task to walk through the labyrinth and reach the natural world on the other side. The people who won't even recognize the task of the hero's journey that faces them are the utterly lost and hopeless midwits who sit in the middle tier of the pyramid, helping to bring this hellscape about by going along to get along, and can never perceive anything until it's too late and they wake up only from the most severe form of violent trauma about what has happened and what is being done to them. And the rest of us kind of live as the kind of cranks of Cassandra, trying to point to the tsunami on the horizon. But it's not to be hopeless, because, that force of evil, if you want to call it Satan or whatever, only has the power to kind of whisper in your ear to destroy yourself. But that's what all this culture is, all this cultural wars, cultural influence. Constantly whispering, and it's not always the horror. It's, it can be smiling and glamorous, entangling the teenage and adolescent mind, and you sort of have to survive a process through to middle age to have a chance to know thyself truly, to know that you face evil, and evil has to be faced down. Because I think the people who have survived through the last few years, 2 or 3 years, are the people who've realised it had to be faced down. And that was through either saying no or just not taking part. While the people who thought you would bend the knee and you would acquiesce your way to freedom, well, they've entangled their faith and their future with the system architects and engineers. And those people are utter cowards and would willingly take you down with them for the sake of a holiday or a rock concert or a nightclub or whatever else. But there is a divine stream of light coming into our reality to connect to, and perhaps there is like a spontaneous grace open to all of us at all times, to open to the ultimate reality and ultimate truth and transcendence. And it's something that's like a birthright to us. And we're faced with a myriad foe of some who are quite obviously evil, and others that are smiling and friendly, always trying to capture us, always trying to shear our wool, our louche, and it weaponizes all the natural instincts of the human being, that desire for love, joy, community, meaning in our lives. It attempts to infiltrate it all. And I think what we have to do is just keep going on, having that conversation about the parallel society, which I imagine is something, if you imagine something that's like parallelsociety.org, and it's like a set of principles that has no leader, no elected positions, but just something that you agree on, I think it has potential. And realizing, community can only be something that's perhaps 200 or 300 people in the real world. Anything else becomes like strange, distorted movements of energy through the internet, and that whips up our emotions and alienates us into things that aren't a part of our lives. But as I said, it's like it's not to be paranoid, but it's to come to terms with the reality facing us, and just looking for something to watch, and even I have to say, enjoying watching this film, but wanting to know the truth, wanting to know reality. It can't be ignored. You can't wish away what faces us, and it's not to be paranoid. It's not to be hopeless. It's to come face to face with reality, so one can actively choose what direction to go in one's life without being pushed downstream. Because the funny thing in Christianity is how it talks about the flock and the shepherd and the sheep and the goats and the wheat and the tares, all quite brilliant metaphors of the natural world, and how clearly all those normies and midwits and so on and so forth, are the sheep who needed, you could say, a program, a reality tunnel, like a software program to guide them through, and how those people have now been sort of guided into a kind of moral relativism of their own destruction and the destruction of their own children, which is just astonishing to witness. To me, it's about the hijacking of a stream of divinity, and different programs are placed in front of that stream, such as Christianity or Islam or Buddhism or Judaism, and that attempts to hijack it and put the sheep in their pen. But what I feel ultimately is that there is an esoteric truth to Christianity and all religion, that there is a birthright of divinity and there is a divine world all around us. But that is a video for another day. If you've seen this film, you can tell me what you think.